Everyone tells you to escape the system, but almost no one ever asks who built that system in the first place. The banks, the oil companies, the foundations that shape education and medicine, the tax-exempt trusts, even the way we think about charity and philanthropy, all of it can be traced back to one man who decided that money wasn't enough. He wanted control. His name was John D. Rockefeller. And if you live in the modern world, you live inside the architecture he helped design. You might never buy a drop of his company's oil, but you still move through a maze of institutions and incentives he deliberately set up more than a century ago. The story of Rockefeller isn't just about a ruthless businessman who became the richest man on earth. It's about how one person can use wealth to quietly rewrite the rules of society so thoroughly that generations later people mistake his design for how the world naturally works. To understand how deep his fingerprints go, you have to start with who John D. Rockefeller was before he became a myth. He wasn't born into old money or European nobility. He came from a modest family in upstate New York, with a father who was a charming con man and a mother who clung to strict Baptist discipline. From his father, he learned that people are manipulable. From his mother, he learned to mask ambition with morality. As a teenager, he was obsessed with numbers, tithing 10% of every small income he earned and keeping meticulous ledgers. That blend of piety and cold calculation would become his trademark. He entered the business world not as a wild speculator, but as a bookkeeper who understood what most men ignored. Power comes not from flashy deals, but from steady control of costs, contracts, and choke points. Oil in the beginning looked like chaos. Wells were drilled like lottery tickets, prices swung violently, and fortunes appeared and vanished in months. The industry was a gold rush with barrels. Rockefeller looked at that chaos and saw an opportunity not to play the game better, but to change the game entirely. While others gloried in striking gushers, he focused on something far less glamorous: refining. Whoever refined the oil and shipped it to market, he realized, stood at the bottleneck of the entire system. That bottleneck could become a valve. Control the valve, and you could control every speculator, every driller, every railroad, every customer. So instead of betting on wells, he built the most efficient refinery he could in Cleveland, then used relentless cost-cutting and volume to underprice everyone else. When rivals went broke, he bought them. When they refused, he strangled them with better shipping rates and secret rebates from railroads. He called this cooperation. The courts later called it monopoly. But Rockefeller's genius wasn't just industrial, it was psychological. He understood that people hate overt tyranny and love stories about stability and progress, so he wrapped his empire in those stories. When critics accused Standard Oil of crushing competition, he described himself as a stabilizer in a dangerous world, protecting workers and consumers from the wasteful duplication of too many small firms. He bought editors and friendly newspapers, funded carefully chosen preachers and professors, and always appeared in public as the calm, soft-spoken Christian gentleman. The more his power grew, the more invisible he tried to make his hand. He preferred owning railroads through secret stock holdings, operating front companies to absorb competitors, sitting behind curtains while his lieutenants took the spotlight. The man building an inescapable system understood one rule: people don't rebel against what they cannot see. The turning point came when Standard Oil became not just a big company, but the circulatory system of the entire American economy. Kerosene lit homes, lubricants powered factories and railroads. Later, gasoline would feed automobiles. It wasn't just about profit anymore, it was leverage over nations. Governments, newspapers, rival industries, they all needed cheap, reliable fuel, and Rockefeller could give or withhold it. He negotiated secret rebates with the railroads so extreme that his competitors ended up subsidizing his shipments. If a refinery resisted a buyout, he could crush its access to transport. If a politician threatened regulation, campaign donations in friendly press could appear or disappear overnight. The more deeply oil seeped into modern life, the more unavoidable Rockefeller became. The system was no longer just a business network, it was infrastructure. Yet for all his power, Rockefeller saw one vulnerability he couldn't buy or bully away: time. No monopoly lasts forever, and he knew that sooner or later public outrage and political pressure would break up Standard Oil as a corporate entity. Most industrialists stop there. They enjoy their run, fight the antitrust case, and accept their losses. Rockefeller thought several moves ahead. If the corporate structure was doomed, he would migrate his power out of the corporate box and into something much harder to attack: foundations, trusts, and institutions that lived above the day-to-day of commerce. Instead of controlling only oil, he would invest in the knowledge that shaped how the public saw oil, medicine, education, even charity itself. The man who started by squeezing margins in refineries ended his life squeezing history itself into a shape that protected his legacy. The first tool he used to move from raw economic power to invisible structural power was the modern tax-exempt foundation. Today, foundations are everywhere. Bill and Melinda Gates, Ford, Rockefeller, Open Society, and we're taught to see them mainly as engines of generosity. But when Rockefeller began experimenting with them, they were something else entirely: a legal innovation that allowed a man hated as a monopolist to transform corporate profits into untouchable influence. At the time, there was intense public anger at concentrated wealth. Journalists like Ida Tarbell exposed Standard Oil's ruthless tactics in widely read exposés. Politicians called him a menace. So Rockefeller did something brilliant. He converted chunks of his fortune into a philanthropic machine, advertising his giving back while quietly locking control into structures that would outlive him and his critics. The Rockefeller Foundation, launched in 1913, was not simply about writing checks to orphans and churches. Its charter allowed it to fund research, education, and public health on a global scale. But there was a catch. The foundation's board decided what counted as the public good. And who dominated the board? Rockefeller family members and trusted allies. Money that had once been criticized as ill-gotten monopoly profit was laundered into benevolence, but the decision-making power stayed in the same hands. Rather than fight every new law or tax individually, Rockefeller created a shielded pool of capital that could shape the very laws and norms of society from the top down. And because it was charity, it enjoyed tax advantages and moral prestige that no corporation could dream of. Nowhere is this more obvious than in how Rockefeller money shaped modern medicine. At the turn of the 20th century, American healthcare was a patchwork of homeopathic schools, herbal traditions, midwives, and a few elite medical colleges modeled on European science. There was no single orthodox system. Rockefeller and his advisors saw an opportunity. If you could standardize medicine around a laboratory science and pharmaceutical treatments, you could not only improve outcomes, but centralize control over what counted as legitimate healing. So the Rockefeller Foundation partnered with the Carnegie Foundation to fund the Flexner Report, a massive survey of medical education that essentially declared most existing schools inadequate. With that one report, backed by money, they created a blueprint: close down unscientific schools, pour funding into a smaller set of allopathic institutions, and require licenses based on that model. Understanding his role also strips some of the aura from today's titans. When a modern tech billionaire launches a huge foundation, talks about reimagining healthcare or education, and coordinates closely with governments and global bodies, you're not watching something new. You're watching an updated Rockefeller script with better branding and a digital UI. The sectors have changed. Software instead of kerosene, data instead of railroads, but the architecture feels familiar. Identify choke points, embed yourself as an indispensable middleman, then use philanthropic narratives to steer public perception and regulation in your favor. The more you study Rockefeller, the easier it becomes to see which of today's empires are trying to become tomorrow's inescapable systems. And that brings us to you, right now, listening to this story. You can't go back in time and stop a young John D. Rockefeller from cutting his first refinery deal, but you can decide how you respond to the structures he helped build. You can choose whether to be a passive consumer of systems or an active mapper of them. When you walk into a doctor's office, a classroom, a bank, or a philanthropic campaign, you can ask, whose interests shaped this design? What assumptions about human beings, about power, about progress are baked into it? Do I accept those assumptions, or do I need to compensate for them in my own choices? Simply asking those questions already puts you in a different relationship to the system. You're no longer just a piece on the board. You're a player who sees the board. John D. Rockefeller built an inescapable system by mastering leverage points most people didn't even know existed. The legacy of that system surrounds you in steel and stone, in syllabuses and statutes, in rituals as mundane as filling a prescription or clocking in at work. You can spend your life cursing it or pretending it isn't there, or you can study it the way he studied his world, coolly, patiently, looking for the points where a small, deliberate action can redirect a much larger force. You may never command an oil empire or endow a university, but in the quiet space between awareness and action, you possess something even Rockefeller couldn't buy: the freedom to decide, in every small choice, whether you are reinforcing his design or quietly, resolutely stepping beyond.